Good afternoon, and welcome to the first ever live event from the Great Exhibition Road Festival's new Explore at Home series. Today, we are exploring the world of magic, talking to an eminent magician about his career and how his conjuring skills are helping educate tomorrow's doctors and medical professionals. My name is James. I work in the public engagement team here at Imperial College, one of the festival partners. Throughout Explore at Home, we will investigate the convergence of creative and artistic disciplines within the worlds of science and engineering and technology. For those who know the Exhibition Road history, in particular why you have research centres like Imperial located next door to art and design institutions like the V&A, you will know that sort of cross-discipline collaboration is kind of what we're all about. These lunchtime day in the life of talks will be a regular feature of Explore at Home. They will be our chance to find out a bit more about the fascinating individuals working behind the scenes of that famous old road that in non-pandemic times we all work on. Today's first guest definitely qualifies as one of those fascinating individuals to kick off this series. First and foremost, Dr. Will Houstoun is a magician and a very good one at that. He's a winner of both the European Magic Championships and the Magic Circle Closeup Magician of the Year. He's also clearly recognised by his peers as a famous television illusionist. Dynamo has credited Will with creating one of his most used tricks whenever he's stopped in the street and asked to perform. He's also a scholar of his craft. The doctor is not just a moniker. He has a PhD in the history of magical education. And here on Exhibition Road, Will is an honorary research associate in Imperial's Faculty of Medicine and a magician in residence at the Centre for Performance Science, which is jointly managed by Imperial and the Royal College of Music. Thank you so much for joining us this lunchtime, Will.
Really lovely to see you.
Just before we get started, I wanted to remind you all watching at home that this is an interactive event, so please do send us your questions and thoughts. My colleagues, Holly and Maeve, are working away in the background. They're monitoring the YouTube chat and will be passing on any comments or questions you have to me, and I can put them to Will. Could I just ask everyone to be considerate of each other when you are posting? We want this to be a welcoming space for online conversations. We love passion and enthusiasm, but let's not disrupt anyone else's experience. So if that's all understood, I think we can get started. Will, throughout this session, we're going to find out a lot more about you and your story and your personal journey. But I wondered, let's talk magic more generally to start off with. What is the key, in your opinion, to a good magic trick? What skills and techniques are involved in performing magic?
Perfect first question. So I think there are a number of different things that go into a magic trick. Some of them are the kinds of things that perhaps one might expect. Some of them are things that perhaps one might not expect. So I thought I could show you something just very, very quick so you at least get a little bit of magic up front for the people who've joined us on time, and then talk a little bit about a couple of the things that go into a piece of magic. So just a very quick trick to start with, something using a playing card. I believe it's the King of Spades in this case. And if I just give it a little flick, you'll see it changes into the 10 of diamonds. So a very, very quick trick indeed, but one which highlights, I think, two aspects of what goes on in magic. One aspect is the story you're telling. Every magic trick has a story, and every magic trick story is not quite what's really happening. So in that case, I suppose the story is that one card changes into another. In fact, clearly one card doesn't really change into another. There's some sort of secret thing which is going on to make that happen. So a fundamental part of every magic trick is that there's what's really happening, and then there's a story that you're telling your audience, which is the fun bit where something impossible seems to happen. One really important little detail of that is that the audience has to know it's a story. If you don't know that I'm doing a magic trick, and I'm not saying it's a magic trick, then I'm a con man or a charlatan or something like this, and that's not my bag at all. So it's important that everyone knows that there are those two narratives in play whenever they see magic. The second thing that often goes into magic tricks is sleight of hand. So perhaps there's some sort of dexterity that the magician is using to make these impossible things seem to happen. Maybe there's some psychology, maybe there's special props, maybe there's a really interesting optical principle. All sorts of things go into that. And normally all of that stuff is kept very, very hidden. Today, however, I thought it might be nice just to give you a little glimpse of the kinds of things that magicians might try and do using sleight of hand. I'm not going to do that by telling you how a magic trick works, because I'm a member of the Magic Circle and I would get kicked out straight away if I did start telling you how tricks work. Instead, I thought I would show you something which demonstrates the kinds of skills that are normally kept hidden. I'll do that by showing you something called a flourish, which is almost like a juggling sort of a stunt, something which is skillful, but where the skill is designed to be seen. So it's something using a pack of cards, and it might be nice to pop to full screen. You're ahead of me, my goodness. So something using a pack of cards, and the idea is this. I'm going to cut the cards in half. Now, when I say half, I do mean in half. There are 52 cards in the pack, so it's important at this point to have 26 over here and 26 over here. Now, after cutting the cards in half, I can give them a little bit of a shuffle. It's the kind of shuffle that lots of people do, where you push the cards together. But again, it's a little bit more precise. The deck was split in half precisely to start with, which means that in this shuffle, I'm able to mix the cards so that they alternate perfectly. So those are alternating 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 from each side of the pack all of the way through the deck. That takes a little bit of practice, but it doesn't look particularly interesting just yet. However, if I push the cards almost all of the way together, like so, you end up with each half of the deck having just a single card gap in between each pair of cards. That allows me to grip the halves very gently, and if I pull them apart so that they're almost all the way apart but not quite, and then I relax just enough that the cards are about to fall, but hopefully not so much that they do fall, something rather strange happens. They sort of blossom outwards into these little fans, and you get this rather pretty sort of a display. So that's a little example of a flourish, and that kind of skill, the things of cutting cards in half perfectly or shuffling them perfectly together, is the kind of dexterity that magicians might work with, although normally they would keep that sort of thing hidden.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Will. So I had a couple of questions. Like I said earlier, please do send in your own ones and we'll put them to Will. So I hinted a little bit at the sort of variety that this career as a magician has taken you down. So when friends ask you, well, maybe not down the pub nowadays, but in the past, when friends have asked you down the pubs, what do you do for a living? Is magician, does that suffice in terms of giving them what they want? Or how do you describe a typical day in your career at the moment, Will?
So I think magician is sort of the best short version of what it is. But I think perhaps just saying magician isn't particularly complete. Because if you say magician, lots of people think maybe you do shows, maybe you do kind of corporate hospitality events, maybe you do children's birthday parties. There are all sorts of different bits that fit under the umbrella term of magician. And I'm interested, I think, in one very, very particular bit of it. Most magicians like showing people magic tricks, so they get that little moment of wow. I think that's interesting, but to me, that's not really enough. The thing I'm interested in is magic, which can be used to achieve something else. So you can show somebody a magic trick, you can get that little moment of wow, but then you can use that to do something. So for example, I've done a fair amount of work doing consultancy for film and television. For example, I worked on a film Hugo, directed by Martin Scorsese, and I was working on The Prince of Egypt, which was in the West End before the pandemic shut the theatres down in the West End. And in those cases, magic is being used not just to give a moment of wow, but to try and give people some sort of narrative journey. It's adding something in that sort of context. I do work at Imperial. Again, I do magic tricks. Magic tricks are a great way of getting people interested, but I'm not out there trying to teach medical students how they can do magic tricks in the pub for their friends. Again, it's using magic as a vehicle through which we can then talk about all sorts of things which are important to somebody in the medical world. One other little example of that, I suppose, would be work with an organisation called Breathe Arts Health Research, who are celebrating their 10th anniversary this year, and they use magic with young people with disabilities. So young people who have challenges moving their hands, perhaps in particular ways because of a stroke-like event, we teach them magic tricks. Those magic tricks incorporate actions which challenge the way these young people are moving their hands, and because they practice the magic tricks, they then end up being able to do everyday tasks like tying up shoelaces, cutting up their food, doing up buttons, all for the first time. So it's all about magic for me, but it's almost always about magic which is being used to achieve something else rather than magic as the end goal.
Brilliant. So that's something else from our perspective. Imperial, we came across you through your work with the medical school and the Centre for Performance Science. Could you talk a little bit more about how that came about and how you've worked within those two institutions, or the sort of things you've done with staff and students?
Certainly. So one of the really exciting things about being a magician who does lots of things which are slightly unconventional is you never know quite what kind of a phone call you're going to get or what email is going to pop in the next day. And a number of years ago, I suspect 6 or 7 years ago now, I had an email from a chap called Roger Kneebone, who's a professor at Imperial, saying that he was going to host a day which was going to be a group of magicians and a group of surgeons chatting about their practices and seeing what kinds of overlap there could be. Initially, I couldn't really see quite what sorts of overlap there could be, but a day spent chatting with surgeons and some of my friends seems like a good thing to do. So great fun, let's have a go at that. I would love to go along. So I went along, I met Roger, who's at Imperial, and we spoke a little bit about the overlap between our worlds. Initially, I think we all thought that the overlap was going to be dexterous stuff, being able to manipulate things with your hands. Fairly soon, though, we realized that actually perhaps a more significant area of overlap is how one interacts with other people. And that thing of how one interacts with other people has sort of formed the foundation of my work with Imperial and within the medical school and with Roger. To give you a little bit of sort of context for that, in some ways there are a lot of similarities between a medical consultation on the one hand and a close-up magic show on the other hand. Of course, you have to get rid of the content. I'm not trying to make sick people better. The medical practitioner is not trying to amaze people with magic tricks. But once you get rid of that, there's a lot of similarity. For example, it's almost always an interaction which lasts for a fairly short amount of time and is with a very small group. Close-up magic is normally done one-on-one or maybe 1 to 2 or 3 people. A medical consultation, again, normally one-on-one or maybe a couple of people if there's somebody younger or a partner there as well. There's almost always a power imbalance. The doctor clearly knows what's going on in the consultation in a way that the patient doesn't. When you do a magic show, you often have people thinking, oh goodness, I hope he's not going to make me feel silly. He knows the secrets to these things, I don't. So you have that sort of power imbalance in the relationship as well. But within that similar framework and that similar dynamic, it's essential that the person who's performing, the magician or the medical practitioner, builds a rapport with the other person really, really quickly. You have to make them want to be there. You have to make them want to be with you and want to interact with you. And it's only by doing that that you can then make the encounter successful. In my case, successful means the person and I collaborate to give that moment of, wow, something impossible happened. In the consultations case, the doctor and the patient collaborate to try and work out what might be wrong and how it might be fixed. But you have to do a number of these sort of similar overarching things to be able to do that. So a lot of work has been spent with Roger, looking at what those overlaps are, how those overlaps fit together, and then also how magic can be used to help doctors think about them. Because if you're a doctor, let's say you're in your 5th year or your 6th year of studying, you've spent a huge portion of your life at that point trying to become a doctor. If somebody says you're not great at talking to people in a consultation, that's kind of a big challenge to your core identity, your belief of who you are, what you do, and what your role in life is. If somebody says, let's have a go at some magic, you're not going to be particularly good at it, then that's fine. You've never thought you were a magician. You've never particularly wanted to be a magician. So finding out you're not great at it is no harm. But by finding out that you're not great at a bit of doing magic and then learning some of the things you can do to make that better in terms of your body language, your eye contact, the way you communicate with other people, you can then take all those skills and put them into your medical practice. And then that can help improve the way that you work.
Great. Now, I know Roger is very open-minded and very open to new ideas of people coming in from other disciplines to look at how they can benefit the education within sort of the medical side of things at Imperial. I'd be interested to know what some of the other people who some of the students, some of the other members of staff who came across you, what sort of reactions did you get? Was everyone on board from the start, or was there some sort of funny looks or some interesting questions when you first arrived?
I think there always has to be a degree of funny look at the beginning of something like this. Somebody says, we're going to work with medical students and we're going to do that using this chap who's a magician. You're just going, sorry, did I mishear you? You must have said something else, but I'm not quite sure what else you could have said. So I think there's always that moment of going, I don't see why that would be relevant. And particularly because most people don't know that much about what magicians do or how they do it. So I think the exciting thing in some ways is working out how to quickly explain that to people in a way that they can then grasp. And then once people grasp the kind of underlying idea, it tends to turn into a really, really exciting collaboration that develops all sorts of new things. I think one of the big things that I've learned from working with Roger is that a lot of the time when people look at people who practice very different areas, whether it's medicine and magic or magic and art or magic and literature or all sorts of other things, you tend to look at all the things that are different. But if instead you try and just remove the things that are different and say what points of connection are there, what areas are there where we can inform what each other do, there are all sorts of exciting and interesting and beneficial things that come out of those conversations.
And have you had, I don't know how long it's been running, this sort of collaboration, but have you had any sort of feedback or sort of any sense that it is making an impact in terms of the sort of the educational development of some of the students going through the school?
So we've done a number of outreach events, which are often held at the Wellcome Collection, and are working with young people, kind of late teens who are thinking about medicine as a career. And we've done afternoon workshops where one of the things they do is learn a bit about magic and its overlap as a way of thinking about what it might be like for them to be a doctor in the future. And I'm pretty sure that's one of the Wellcome Collection's most subscribed events. We've always run 4 or 5 workshops in the day. Each one of those workshops, I think, has had 60 or 70 young people in it. And there's almost always been an overflow of people who just can't get in because there isn't enough room. So it's certainly been quite popular in that sort of context. We've also done an amount of work with undergrads at Imperial, and we've done sort of a number of scene setting events where we've talked about some of these ideas. And from the questions and feedback we've had, it seems to have been well received, but it's fairly early in the process of developing that. So perhaps a bit too early to say this is definitely a clearly good thing for 90% of the audience or anything specific like that.
Great. I'd like to sort of go back into your sort of story a little bit, Will. So we had a question from Bob, who asked, how did you start learning magic? So yeah, maybe you can take us back to sort of day one, that first magic trick, magic box that you were bought, or I don't know what your origin story as a magician is, but if you could take us back there and tell us how it all started, that'd be great.
Sure. Origin story makes it sound like it's going to be something terribly exciting with a radioactive spider, and I'm afraid it's not going to be quite so exciting. Essentially, when I was in my early teens, 11 years old or thereabouts, I was given a magic trick for Christmas one year, as lots and lots of young people are. And after being given that, it happened that a friend of my grandmother's was a professional magician and a member of the Magic Circle. He wasn't somebody I knew. He was sort of a friend from her past who she kept in touch with through Christmas cards and birthday cards, as grandmas want to. But she wrote a note to him saying that I had been given a magic trick, and I think slightly overstating things and saying I was now a magician. He very kindly wrote back to her and asked her if she would mind giving him my parents' address. He then wrote to them and asked if they would mind him writing a letter to me. And then out of the blue, as far as I was concerned, I got a letter from an actual bona fide magician saying that he was fascinated to hear about the magic I was doing, and he did magic too, and sending me a magic book and a couple of magic tricks. It's the most exciting thing I think that could happen to any 11-year-old. I suspect most people would sort of grow out of magic a few years after that. I never quite got around to the growing out of it bit. So magic remained a hobby through my teens. I went to university to start with and did a master's degree in mechanical engineering. It was great, but perhaps not quite my cup of tea. So I had a gap year or two where I researched late 18th century card tricks for a book and taught other magicians how to do magic stuff in America and did shows in Spain. A few gap years turned into 4 or 5 gap years. And then that turned into a PhD in a literature, film and theatre department, looking at Victorian magic and specifically the way a particular book in the Victorian period reframed magic as an educational tool. And that sort of brings us to where we are today with magic as an educational tool.
Was there any, I was interested in any particular piece of advice. I don't know if it was that sort of family friend or anyone or any other advice you got given maybe during a PhD or something that's sort of stuck with you, that's sort of stuck with you throughout your career so far?
So I think one of the really big things is a piece of advice that has sort of floated through from the Victorian period.
Oh.
So I did my PhD based on a chap's book. The chap was called Professor Hoffman, and his book was Modern Magic. It was published in 1876, and it was by far the most popular magic book that had ever been written at that point, and led to a sort of explosion in people writing books about magic, selling magic kits to young people, doing magic shows for people. All of that world sort of blew up. As it happens, that book, Modern Magic, is the first one that this friend of my grandfather's sent me when I was a young boy of 11. So that book had sort of been with me for a while. I studied it for my PhD, and the key thing that Hoffman did is he said that young people should learn to do magic practically. There had been books which told people how tricks were done. Hoffman said that knowing how a trick is done is really not the same as being able to do it. And he tried to write a book that would teach people how they could do magic for other people rather than just telling them the secret behind a trick. In addition, he said that it was important that young people learnt this skill, not because everyone should become a magician, but rather because by learning a bit of magic and being able to perform a bit of magic, young people would learn how to present in front of an audience, they would learn how to talk to people, they would learn how to write and convey a narrative, they would learn how to problem solve, they would learn how to deceive, and they would learn how to spot deception from other people. And all of those skills, he suggested, would be useful in people's professional lives, and as it was then, the furtherance of the British Empire's goals. So he very much made this idea clear that people could learn magic, and learning magic was not just about learning magic, but it was about teaching all of these other things. And that's an approach which has really stuck with me and has sort of become the backbone, I suppose, of what I do.
Brilliant. We've had a couple of questions come in through the live chat. Lance has asked, can you talk a little bit more about how magic is used in positive influence, either verbally or visually? He says, like with the doctor example you've just talked about. Can you illuminate us a little bit more on that, Will?
Sure thing. So magicians, I suppose, have lots of different tools they use to try and shape people's attention. And one of the common misnomers is the idea it's about misdirection. So it's about making people not look in the place you want them to. It's really hard to make somebody not look at something. And even saying, don't look at my glasses, means you have to think about glasses and look at the glasses before realizing you're not going to look at them. So instead of being about misdirection, I think most magicians nowadays would think about it as being direction. So the idea is that throughout an encounter, you're trying to direct people's attention and make sure they're focusing on the things that are most important in the experience you want to create. One of the tools that magicians use to do that is the eyes. Magicians love eyes. They're able to do all sorts of interesting things. And there's a rule that a Scottish greengrocer, who was a great magician, came up with, which was that if you want somebody to look at you, you should look at them. And if you want them to look at something, you should look at that something. So if I hold up a playing card and I look at it, you're going to look at it. And then if I stop and I look up at you, you're going to end up looking back at me. And if I come back to the card for a moment, you're going to end up going back to the card for a moment. So just by choosing where you look, you can shape where people's attention is. It's almost like you've got a spotlight built into your eyes and you can use it to shine a light on things. For magicians, that's really useful, just being able to focus attention. One of the interesting places this overlaps with the world of the doctor is the sort of side effect of it. The idea that if you want somebody to look at something, you should look at it. The corollary of that is, if you don't want something to look at something, you should probably not look at it. And I think something that happens all the time when you go and see your GP, perhaps, is that you're explaining some sort of problem to him or her, which feels like a big deal to you. And halfway through that explanation, they turn off to one side and start typing on their computer. So you know their attention is now on their computer screen and not on you. You probably can't see the screen, so maybe they're just making notes, but maybe they don't know what you're talking about. They're looking it up on Google. Who knows what's going on there? And it starts to make you as the patient feel a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit worried. So you see GPs do this all the time. The look at it rule makes it clear why that feels uncomfortable. Another thing that magicians spend a lot of time doing is trying to justify things that seem weird. So if you have to put your hand in your pocket in the middle of a trick, that's a very, very weird thing to do and quite a suspicious thing to do in a performance. So you might put your hand in your pocket a number of times beforehand so that people get used to that action and they feel that it's just part of your normal, natural mannerism. In the case of the GP looking at the laptop, a great example of how you can get around that is to explain it before the audience doubt it. So rather than putting your hand in your pocket and then sheepishly explaining it and looking a bit guilty, if you explain to your audience why you need to put your hand in your pocket and then do, that's far less likely to arouse suspicion. So if you're telling me something and I'm a doctor and I need to go to my laptop to make notes, a really good thing for me to do is to say, sorry for interrupting you, but I just need to make a couple of notes on this to make sure I get all the details right. So I'm just going to be typing a couple of things on my laptop. Please keep telling me stuff. And then you type. And now nobody needs to worry about it. Nobody's kind of concerned about it anymore. The whole thing flows much more smoothly. So those might be a couple of examples, I suppose, of how magicians' control over attention and their thoughts on this can pop into a different discipline.
It's fascinating, yeah. Reverse engineering, or looking at tools that are used for deception and how you can almost do the inverse to create a sense of trust or honesty. It's a really interesting way of looking at things. We had a couple of questions which were sort of linked together that I'll put to you, but put both of them to you. So Yashwant asked, what's the toughest trick you've ever learnt and why was it so tough? And David asked, what's the most complicated part of being a magician? So I don't know if those two things will have the same answer or not, but I'll put them both to you, Will.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And so I think the most complicated thing that you've ever learned isn't ever really a kind of constant. It's not the same thing all the time, because something that seemed almost impossible to me as a 14-year-old now seems automatic and incredibly easy to me. So I think probably the most complicated thing I've ever learned is almost always the newest, most difficult thing that I can't quite yet do. So there's always new things that I want to try and learn, new ways of holding cards or manipulating cards or moving cards. And the one that I'm practicing but can't quite do yet is almost always the most challenging one. And I think that sort of ties in with the other part of the question as well, because I think often the most challenging part of being a magician or of doing anything is trying to do that thing which is just on the edge of what you're capable of doing and what you're not capable of doing. So if I was trying to show you one of the things I'm working on at the moment, which is definitely outside my comfort zone, that would be quite high risk. A lot of my focus would start going on to doing the thing right, and I would lose all of my capacity to think about where the camera is and who I'm talking to and what the question I'm answering is, and all of that other stuff, which is really important. So I think probably the most difficult thing to do for people is always that thing which is outside your comfort zone. And the thing that follows from that, which as a magician I try to do, and certainly when I've been at the Royal College of Music, I've talked with some of the musicians about trying to do, is to make sure that anything you're doing in performance, and by performance I don't just mean a show, I mean any context where it's important that it works, is a couple of notches below the kinds of things that are sort of on the edge of what you're capable of. So if I wanted to show you something in this context, I would always make sure I was practicing something which is several notches harder, so that when it comes to a performance setting, a live setting where it's important, I can step down the difficulty level a bit, and that gives me more room to think about all of the unexpected stuff that you don't know will happen, but will happen, and you have to try and deal with.
I wondered, do you think there's more scope for live performers like magicians to sort of lend their skills and expertise to other disciplines? I don't want to use the word retrain because that's been in the news quite a lot recently. But I think there seems to be value in these sort of live performance skills in lots of different jobs and roles. Is there others that you've come across or others you might aspire to work with? I know my colleague Maeve put a question in the chat. So if any of our viewers at home have some suggestions, it would be great to hear them. We'll read them out. But maybe I'll come to you first, Will, with any experience or any sort of aspirations of other sectors that might benefit from you lending a bit of expertise.
Sure. So I think this sort of lending of expertise is a really good thing, and very, very different from the idea of ballet dance or retraining in cyber, which seems like a nonsense in a great many ways. And I think this stuff is useful in all sorts of areas. If you have to stand up in front of people and do a presentation with a PowerPoint slide behind you, knowing about eye contact is incredibly useful, because if you're talking about what's on the slide at the same time as looking at people, they're not going to know where to look. They're going to feel like they should look at you because you're looking at them, and you're telling them to look at the slide, and it's just going to feel awkward. If you know about the eye contact thing, it's then really easy to say I should talk to people, and then when I talk about the slide, I should turn around and talk about it, and then I should come back and I should carry on talking to people face to face afterwards. So I think all of these little rules are really useful in a huge number of different scenarios. And I don't think it's just magic or it's just performance art. I think it's things from all sorts of disciplines that are useful elsewhere. One of the other things, I suppose, that's come up working with Roger is that every sort of discipline, I think, has things it takes for granted, things that are just base level. Everybody who's a magician knows this. This is just obvious. But it's not obvious to people who are outside that world, who perhaps haven't come across things in the same way as you have. And often those little obvious things are quite easy to implement, they're quite easy to develop and easy to change, and they make a big difference when you do so. So I'm sort of all for, I suppose, the mixing of ideas from different areas, and whether it's from magic or performance to other areas, or from other areas to performance, both are great.
Great. Taking it back to sort of the profession of magic itself, we had a really good question, I think, from Theo about the sort of magic in the modern age, I guess. So he's asked about, magic is typically performed in person in an intimate, close-up setting. How is magic adapted to use technology for remote performances, and what can we learn from it? So they're particularly relevant now and during the pandemic and during lockdowns. Any thoughts on that, Will?
It really is incredibly important and incredibly big question. So a great question, Theo. And as it happens, a friend from Dublin and I started a project about a month after lockdown started, where we were looking at what the possibilities might be for shows that are done via video chat, and what kinds of new opportunities there might be in that space. And I think there are some details which are maybe magic specific, but there's sort of a big overarching point to it, which I think is relevant for anyone who's looking at that, which is that the first thing magicians did when the pandemic struck and the idea of doing shows via Zoom or StreamYard or YouTube or these sorts of things came up was to say, I can probably do the same tricks that I used to do live for people in person, and I can just adapt them a little bit. And maybe I lose this bit and this bit and this bit that I really liked, but I can still keep most of it. And the problem with thinking about it that way, the problem with thinking about taking what you used to do and just sort of transplanting it into this new setting, is that you inevitably make compromises. And so the best case scenario is that you end up with a slightly compromised version of what you would have done live. And the only thing you're going to get is a worse version of the in-person experience. A far more useful way of thinking about moving into this virtual space, I think, is to say it's different. In the same way as doing magic for somebody at a restaurant is different from doing magic for somebody in a 3,000-seat theatre, and doing magic for somebody in a 3,000-seat theatre is different from doing magic on television. Doing magic via Zoom, where you do have a live audience who you can interact with in real time, but you also have the camera and some of those things that you get from TV, is a new performance space. And it's not going to let you do some of the things that you used to love doing when you were doing close-up shows or stage shows, but it is going to let you do things that have never been possible in any other environment. For example, if you're doing magic via Zoom, let's say, you can easily do magic for a family, and it can be a family where one person lives in Australia, one person lives in America, one person lives in Germany. They don't get to see each other. They haven't met in person for 3 years, but they can come together in that show and have a live experience together in a way which would just not be viable financially in any other setting. Another thing that you can do is you can make sure that everyone gets the best possible experience. If you're doing a show, even for, let's say, 100 people, when you're doing magic, there are those points where you want to look at people in the eye. And the best thing you can do with 100 people is to pick a sort of group of the audience and try and look at them. And that way you'll get maybe 10 or 20 people who feel like your attention was on them at that optimum moment. If you're doing a show via Zoom, everyone knows it's a live experience, but also by looking at the camera, you can make it feel like you're looking straight into every single person's eyes. So that point in the trick, which is made better if you do it whilst looking at somebody, you can look straight at every single person in that 100-strong audience, and you can do that bit, and that bit of the trick will be better because of it. So I think there's huge amounts of scope for magic to adapt. I think it's hugely exciting because people have thought about all of these other performance settings for decades, if not centuries. And this one, the idea of performing via Zoom, is something that magicians have only really thought about for a few months. So it's a space where there's huge amounts of innovation to be made, and there are huge developments that can be made really quite quickly. And I suspect that's the same for people in all sorts of other areas as well.
Thank you very much for that, Will. We're not on Zoom at the moment, but was there a demonstration or a trick that works particularly well for you in the sort of online setting? Was there a second thing you were going to show us, I think?
Sure. So I can show you something else which sort of does fit in with this question. Thanks for prompting me along in that direction.
Yeah.
So one of the big advantages, I suppose, of this kind of setting is you can do tricks for large audiences in a way which is live, which people know is live. It's not pre-recorded. You don't have camera edits or any of that possibility in it, but you can do things that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So one of my favorite tricks is a coin trick, and it's a trick which I think is one of the most magical things I do. But it's a trick which very, very few people have ever seen. And the reason very few people have seen this trick live is because it only works really well for one or maybe two people at a time. It's the kind of trick that you do sitting in a coffee shop at the table with somebody sitting opposite you, and then you show them this thing. That's great, but it means that if you wanted to show it to 100 people, you'd have to have a queue around the block and people coming in 2 by 2 to watch it. Via this medium or via something else like Zoom, I'm able to show you that trick no matter how many people there are. Because I've set up a little camera just opposite me on the table, which is in the same position you would be if you were sitting in this room here with me, and lets you see this trick as though you were that one person or one of those two people who get to see this trick at a time. So I'd like to show you a little thing which uses 4 large old silver coins, and I'm just going to switch across to a different camera so that you get a good view of what happens. So imagine you're sitting opposite me at the table, and this would be a little trick which you perhaps wouldn't get to see otherwise. So something which uses 4 of these large old silver dollars, and something which is a little bit different from almost every other coin trick that I know. Because from now, I'm not going to touch the coins. Instead, I'm just going to keep my hand ever so slightly above them the whole time. If I just give a little wave, hopefully you'll see something happen. 1 goes, followed by a second, and then a third. With another little wave, 1 goes back, followed by the second, and then the third. And then if I cover everything up for just a moment, we should find all 4 coins pop up together into one corner. So that's one of my favorite tricks, I would say. It's a trick that I very, very much enjoy doing, but it's a trick which is only really possible to do in this kind of setting, where I'm able to put that camera in the right place so you can all see it and be able to convey it to such a large group at once.
Brilliant. It was good for me, but that my camera wasn't on screen during that time, because you would just see my face doing like this for a good 30 seconds. That was brilliant. That was amazing. Well, really.
Pretty much what my face was doing as well.
Good. We had a question taking it back to sort of this world you've entered by joining us or working with us at Imperial, from Emilio, which I think is really interesting. He asked, do you think showing people magic tricks encourages scientific skepticism? Now, he mentions 2 people here that I'm not aware of. He says, I'm thinking of James Randi and Penn Jillette. You may know them. I don't, unfortunately. So maybe, yeah, it'd be great to get your thoughts on that, and maybe you could mention a little bit about those 2 characters.
Sure, absolutely. So Penn Jillette is one half of Penn and Teller, who are a duo who do shows in Vegas, and they have a show called Fool Us, which is on television a fair amount at the moment. And Teller is sort of the quiet one, and he likes historical magic, a very, very smart magician. Penn is the one who talks a lot and is quite sort of heavy in the skeptical movement. So yeah, that's sort of his bag. James Randi is also very much part of the skeptical movement. He started life as an escapologist and then really became famous debunking Uri Geller. Uri Geller was a man who claimed he had psychic powers, and the main result of his psychic powers was that he was able to make spoons bend, which seems like one of the least useful skills to have if you do have genuine psychic powers. James Randi made a career out of basically following Uri around and saying he doesn't have psychic powers, he's a magician, and trying to work out ways to demonstrate to people that this might not be psychic powers, it might be something else. And I think magic does do that quite well, and has done that quite well for quite a long time. A good example of that is one of the first books in the English language which talks about magic tricks and how they're done. It was written by a chap called Reginald Scott, who was a justice of the peace, and it was published in 1584. It was called The Discovery of Witchcraft. Now, it wasn't really a magic book, But this was during an era in which hundreds or thousands of people were persecuted for being witches. So people believed that these women, mainly women who lived alone, were witches. They were practicing supernatural things. They were in league with the devil, and they should be punished, burned at the stake, and so on and so forth. Reginald Scott was saying, I don't think that's necessarily always the case. And sometimes these things which seem supernatural might be something else. He then gives all sorts of examples of what these things might be. And amongst those examples, he uses magic tricks. And he uses magic tricks to say, look, this seems supernatural, but it isn't. It's just somebody hiding something in their hand, or secretly changing one card for another, or some other sort of a trick. So the idea of using magic as a way of sort of debunking the supernatural goes back an awful long way. It then comes through the Victorian period, where spiritualism, the belief that perhaps you could contact dead people, and the scientific investigation of that idea was a hugely popular phenomenon. And during that period, magicians were called on quite a lot, really, to try and look at how these experiments were being run and whether they gave people room to cheat or not. And then comes through to the present day, although I would say perhaps in a sort of less significant way than in the late Victorian period, with people like James Randi and Pendulette, absolutely. So I think magic is an interesting thing. It's a useful thing. It certainly gives you a way of saying that maybe not everything that you think you've seen is genuinely what you've seen. But I don't know that there's a huge amount being done with it to sort of debunk things in the same way that historically there has been.
Potentially an opportunity, I guess, maybe. We had a question from Bernie about whether there's anywhere that he can, or you can point people to learn more about what magicians can teach us about communicating with others and eye contact. As yourself, has any of the other magician community sort of published anything or regularly talks about this that we can get people to sort of do a little Google search for?
That is a very good question. And I think the big challenge with this and with all of these sort of interdisciplinary things is that it's very hard to know which particular little bit out of a huge sort of body of knowledge is useful to any particular person in a given situation. And so almost everything that I've done has been interacting with people live and in person. And the thing about that is that I know all of the things I know, and I can find out a bit about the things that other people know and the problems they're trying to solve. And then I can pick the little 1% of the things I know that are useful to them and sort of give them that bit. Doing it in a book form or something like that is much more challenging because you don't know who the person is or what the thing they're trying to get out of it is. Something which it might be a nice thing to plug, I suppose, is that Roger Kneebone has a book which has recently been published called Expert. And it's a book which sort of traces the stages that it takes to become expert in any given practice. And in that book, there are huge numbers of examples of places where Roger has collaborated with people like a three-dimensional embroiderer or a stone carver or a tailor or a magician, and how that has sort of changed the way that both groups perhaps think about what they do. So that might be a kind of a fun read. It's not a, here are 7 practical tips that are going to change the way you do something read. But maybe Roger's book, Expert, would be a fun place to start, at least.
Brilliant. And this may be the final question, depending on how long the answer is, I guess. But it's quite a nice personal story / question from Charlotte, who says that her dad is a magician in his free time and has been doing magic performances on Zoom for local families during lockdown, which sounds lovely. She had a specific question to give him some advice around lighting and how to get the best lighting to use at home. Is there any sort of thoughts or tips you can provide there, Will?
My goodness, that's a very good question. And I'm not quite sure how best to answer it, because part of me wants to say that for 6 months, I've been working on a charity project, which has been talking to magicians about how they can do this kind of stuff. And if your dad is a magician and is interested in this, he might go and visit videochatmagic.com and take a little look there. There are 50 or so different essays from various people about stuff you can do. And one of those people is a Hollywood cinematographer who did films like 300 and Watchmen, talking about how you can set up your cameras, your lighting, and all those things to make your Zoom show as good as possible. If your dad does go there, you should do it before the end of October, because that's when the project ends. And if he does decide to join it, his subscription will be donated to charity and part of around $30,000 that we've raised for charity during the lockdown. So that would be my kind of long answer. I suppose my shorter answer would be that I think having a little bit of lighting is better than no lighting. So I haven't done a huge amount in this setting, but I have got a small ring light over on that side of me, which is sort of making a fill, making sure this side of my face isn't too shadowy. And I've got a soft box over on that side, which is giving kind of a nice bright wash of light. And I've made sure that all of my curtains and things are closed so that you aren't seeing bright red reflections every time a double-decker bus goes past the window. So just spending a little bit of time doing that kind of thing, I think, is a good, quick answer.
Brilliant. And I want something from me just to finish off, Will. The collaboration with Roger, is that an ongoing project? What does the work that you've been doing with the medical school, what will that look like over the coming 6 months to a year? As much as we can say, I guess there may be some uncertainty, but what does the future hold in terms of that collaboration?
It's very much an ongoing thing. Roger and I have a number of online events which are going to be happening, sort of a range of discussions and so forth. And if you're interested in Roger's work, you should have a look at his Gresham College lectures. I did one of them. There's a number of others with other people. But our work is going to continue in terms of those kind of public conversations where we share some of the things we already know and hopefully uncover some new things along the way as we chat about this sort of stuff. There are also then a number of research projects looking at how some of the stuff that I've looked at for magic over Zoom can be used in the context of doctor-patient consultations, perhaps, which are also having to happen in this setting, as well as things where we're going to look at how the skills of the magician can be used in an educational context with undergraduate people learning about medicine to try and help them become better doctors in the future. So yeah, absolutely, there's ongoing research happening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of this lunchtime discussion. Thank you so much, Will, for joining us, showing us those tricks, giving us a little bit of insight of what a day in the life of a magician looks like and the various varied places it can take you, I guess, if you're that way inclined. Please, everyone at home, join me in giving Will a little virtual round of applause for taking the time over his lunch break to talk to us. For those watching live on YouTube, apologies if we were unable to get to your questions. We had some really great ones. A recording of this discussion will soon appear on the Great Exhibition Road Festival YouTube channel, so you can watch that again, share with friends or colleagues or whoever you want. All future live events and recorded video content from the festival will be appearing on this YouTube channel, the Great Exhibition Road Festival YouTube channel. So do follow us and you'll get notifications when new live events appear, or recorded videos to watch in whenever you want, really. Whenever they're posted, you'll get a little notification. I think my colleagues, Maeve is going to post in the chat a link to an evaluation form where you can tell us a little bit about this event. This is the first one we've done, so we would really appreciate your feedback. Let us know how it went. Let us know how the format was. Otherwise, that's it from me. I'll thank you to everyone who tuned in. Thank you to everyone who joined us and sent in questions. I'll leave you to your lunches and have a lovely Friday afternoon, everybody. That's it from the Great Exhibition Road Festival Explore at Home. Thank you very much.